And we are live. Good afternoon. I feel like we should say Happy New Year again. This is our first live stream since the Kwanzaa celebration, correct?
Correct?
Wow. Well, good afternoon to you, our resident facilitator, Sister Khara House. Um, I'm excited about today. Happy MLK Day weekend, and we're kicking off our celebration officially today um, with a presentation that is not the typical presentation about Dr. King and Selma and I Have a Dream. And this is, I like to describe as a presentation about the radical king. And, we always say that we do these to enlighten, inform, and educate, Sister Kara. And so, not many people are aware of the evolution, I like to say, of King towards the unfortunate or untimely end of his reign. And so that is what we're here to talk about. And as always, we invite our viewers to post questions and comments so that we can have a great discussion at the end of the presentation. With that being said, Sister Kara, I turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. As Ms. Bernadine said, we are very excited for this session. This is at least the second year that Professor McAllister has joined us for a special session on Dr. King. So we are excited to hear what he brings us today. Professor Greg McAllister is a lecturer with a master's degree in history and a graduate certificate in ethnic studies from NAU. His research focuses on the history of African Americans in the Southwest, the formation of race in the United States, and African interaction with Indigenous peoples and Latinos in North America. Professor McAllister brings a varied background as a historian, percussionist, and artist. Welcome, Professor McAllister.
Just to see where everyone is at with Martin Luther King. So I just want to do an open association. You could put in the chat. So when someone says Martin Luther King, what is the first thought that comes to mind? Go ahead and put that in the chat. What comes to mind? Someone says Martin Luther King. Or I could ask my my two hosts. I don't see anything in the chat.
So, Professor, we're actually, there's a banner if you see on your screen. So, one of the answers was nonviolence.
Okay, very good. Okay, nonviolence. Okay. What else? Okay, nonviolence. Peacemaker, very good. Okay, good. So peacemaker, nonviolence. For me, I'm still. This is still my impression. I always think of "I Have a Dream." You know, I always think of the "I Have a Dream" speech when the name Martin Luther King comes up. Freedom fighter. Okay, good, good. I would say a more recent concept that I get when I think of Martin Luther King is hope. Yeah, definitely hope. Okay. Oh, also from the community. Okay, good, good. freedom fighter, nonviolence, peacemaker. Yeah, very important concepts. So I always like to, when I talk about Martin Luther King, first find out where people are at with him, their ideas, their concepts. But also I like to start out with a confession. Not that I do this as a religious practice. I don't confess to priests. But for years and years, and I know that we all struggled to have Martin Luther King's birthday celebrated, right? And for years, I would go to Martin Luther King celebrations. In fact, I think I went to a march in Atlanta one year. But since I've been in Flagstaff, every year I've done the march with a couple of exceptions. And when I first came here, there would be the march from Du Bois to from North Campus to South Campus. And there would be reporters there, and people would have signs, and the reporter would be asking people, what do you think of Martin Luther King? Why is he significant, and so on. And I was always terrified, being one of the few Black people in the march, that they would come up to me and ask, okay, what does Martin Luther King mean to you? Because to be honest, I felt that King was not necessarily relevant to the 21st century, to 21st century issues. And I have to be honest that I was ashamed that I didn't feel like he was relevant, because I have benefited from the civil rights movement. And I'm working here because of that, right? That my life has been paved based on the sacrifices of this movement. But that said, I still felt that it wasn't relevant to the 21st century. And the reason for that, the reason why I felt King was not relevant, because I didn't feel like he was addressing issues. Okay? But that's the King of 1963. That's the King of the March on Washington. Okay, this is the King that has been quote unquote pacified. Cornel West says that King has been Santa Clausified. Okay, in many ways, King is another founding father. So often, in the American imagination, we can now include Martin Luther King with Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Okay. So what I want to do is talk about the Martin Luther King of 1967 and 1968. I think it's important to point out that at the time of his death, King had a 72% approval rate from white America and a 55% approval rate from Black America. Okay, so the King that we celebrate is not necessarily that King of 1968. And so what I'd like to do is talk about what happened. Okay, now King, for the longest time during the movement, he was aware of the war in Vietnam. And it was between 1966, 1967, he began to become more concerned. You had the young radicals, Stokely Carmichael, that were already moving against the war in Vietnam in terms of a peace movement. The SNCC was involved in the early manifestations of the peace movement of the 60s. But there's a story about King when he's on vacation in the West Indies. And he's reading an article in a magazine, and he sees the pictures of this war and carnage that's taking place in Vietnam. He sees pictures of men, women, and children, dead from napalm bombing. I mean, children with burns, dead bodies, and he literally weeps when he sees these pictures. And we have to remember that, Martin Luther King is a minister, of the faith of Jesus Christ. He believes in the oneness of humanity. He believes in brotherhood. He believes that every single human being on the planet is a precious soul. And so, this is a part of King that we often don't really understand. Okay. That his position in terms of violence is not only in terms of being nonviolent in terms of struggle, political struggle and activism, but also in terms of the state, that he had the same attitude that the state should be nonviolent as well. Not just Black folks in terms of our struggle and our solutions to social problems, but the state itself should be nonviolent, because nonviolent is ethical. Nonviolence is ethical. This is an ethical position that he takes. So I'd like to go to this next slide here. Okay, so this is a speech that changed Martin Luther King's life. It's called Beyond Vietnam. So he makes this speech exactly a year before his death, before he is assassinated, before he is executed. Now, when King spoke against the war in Vietnam, he lost a lot of his support from the Northern liberals, but also many among the Black leadership class. That many people felt that you should not, you just need to stay with Black issues. Don't talk about the war in Vietnam. The war in Vietnam has nothing to do with Black people. Just stay in civil rights. So in other words, stay in your place, boy. Don't talk about international issues. So I'd like to go ahead and read and just emphasize certain points to this speech. He says here, I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, so what world revolution is he talking about? The world revolution that he is giving reference to are the revolutions that were taking place in both Asia and Africa in terms of liberating. These were liberation movements that were taking place, throwing off the yoke of France in Africa, throwing off the yoke of France of Britain in Africa as well. So you had the emerging African nations that were taking place during this period. The war in Vietnam is an example of a liberation movement freeing the Vietnamese people from France. So this was something that was taking place. Okay. So again, we as a nation must undergo, I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. Now, radical here means going to the root of something. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. Now, throughout this year, the last year of his life, he is constantly referring to these. What else do I want to say about this? So again, the materialism that King is talking about, this is a coded word for capitalism, but also King also critiqued communism because it justified violent revolution. King's idea here is that the ends does not justify the means. So you have to have an ethical ends to have, well, you have to have an ethical process to have an ethical end, okay? So if we're talking about a just society. Okay, we can move on to the next quote. All right, so this is from an essay by King, written by King. It's called A Testament of Hope. This was actually published after his death, so it was posthumously published. So I'm going to take my time with this because this is a very rich quote. So here he says, millions of Americans are coming to see that we are fighting in an immoral war that costs nearly $30 billion a year. We are perpetuating racism. So this is an interesting idea in the 21st century, that wars perpetuate racism. So here's where I want to ask you, those of you out there in the chat, so how many wars are we involved in right now? Feel free to take a guess. How many wars are we involved in currently? Okay, 3 or 4. Okay. Anyone else? 18. Wow. Okay, that's the record. Because I ask my students this every semester. Wow. All right, I'm gonna have to look into that. 18. 11. Yeah. Yeah, so this is an example of where King is relevant now, right? If we're involved in all these wars. So we are perpetuating racism, that we are tolerating almost 40 million poor during an overflowing of material abundance. Yet they, meaning we, remain helpless to end the war, to feed the hungry, to make brotherhood a reality. This has to shake our faith in ourselves. If we look honestly at the realities of our national life, it is clear that we are not marching forward. Now, this is interesting reading this 2022. We are groping and stumbling. We are divided and confused. Our moral values and our spiritual confidence sink even as our material wealth ascends. In these trying circumstances, now to me, this is the most important piece here. In these trying circumstances, the Black Revolution is much more than the struggle for the rights of Negroes. I'm going to read that again. The Black Revolution is much more than the struggle for the rights of Negroes. It is forcing America to face all its interrelated flaws, interrelated. So here he says racism and poverty. Often he uses the term economic exploitation. In fact, throughout the last year of his life, he would also substitute the word poverty with economic exploitation. In fact, King argues that economic exploitation and racism are inseparable from each other. So next time you hear someone say racist or racism, think about that it's intricately connected with economic exploitation. So if we think about genocide of indigenous genocide, the taking of indigenous land to create wealth, you had the racial ideology, behind that, which justified the oppression, but you also had the wealth that was created by taking indigenous land. Same thing with slavery, right? Slavery created, at one point, there was the margin of 1,700% profit, okay? At one point in our history, there was more investment in Black bodies, more investment in other human beings than there was in gold and even real estate. Okay, there would be no insurance companies. There would be no banking without slavery. So that's why economic exploitation is an important element to look at here. Okay, militarism, and this can include slave patrols. This can include, in a sense, if we're talking about white identity, a policing class. I mean, one of the issues that we're constantly dealing with is, certain European Americans calling cops on Black folks, right? In a sense, that's the role of whiteness, is to do that, okay? Again, it's linked with racism, militarism, materialism. Again, that's about the wealth that's involved. King often talked about the thingification of the Negro, but you can even think about the thingification of working people as well. If you want to look at the situation we're now in with the virus. Okay, it is exposing evils that are rooted deeply in the whole structure of our society. It reveals systemic rather than superficial flaws and suggests that radical reconstruction of society itself is the real issue to be faced. Now, I want to give you some books to look into if you want to go deeper into this. There's a book that's edited by Cornel West. It's called The Radical King. And really, this is a book written by King, edited by Cornel West. So this has all of his speeches dealing with many of the relevant issues that we are dealing with today, if we're talking about the four evils or the four flaws. Another book by Vincent Harding is called Martin Luther King, the Inconvenient Hero. And then thirdly is a book that I haven't quite finished reading yet. It's called Prophet of Discontent, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Critique of Racial Capitalism. Now, I think what I'd like to do, as we open this into a discussion, I want to use a quote from John Henry Clark. If we could go to that quote. Oh, sorry. All right, let me just review these, and then we'll go to that quote. Sorry. Okay, so King often talked about the triplets. Sometimes he would talk about these concepts in terms of racism and economic exploitation. So he would say, okay, like going to his speech of 1967, he said they're the triplet evils of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism. He would often talk about the evils of racism, economic exploitation, and war. He would say that these are all tied together. And I'm hoping that if there's anything that I'd like you to take away from this, is that we can begin to think about many of the present issues in a systematic way. And I think King lays this out in a very systematic way. Going back to his 1967 speech, he would say that a revolution of values would cause us to question many of our past and present policies. So I use the four evils when I talk about settler colonialism. I use the book Indigenous History of the United States, and with that book, which is really talking about, more of the indigenous stuff that happened with indigenous people, you can put it in the context of these four evils, these four flaws: white supremacy, economic exploitation, militarism, and materialism. Okay, and then the next slide, please. Okay, so we have these holidays, right? We have MLK Day, we have Juneteenth, we have Kwanzaa that just ended, and I think about each of these particular holidays, relating to Black folks. Well, you can even take the 4th of July and put that in the context as well. You can take each of these holidays and use these days to reflect. And so I want to use this quote. I really want to end with this quote, because I feel like we can look at King's analysis of America's four flaws and see where we are in terms of our clock. Okay, so what clock am I talking about? So here, John Henry Clark says, history is a clock that people use to tell their political, cultural time of day. What time is it, right? It is a compass that people use to find themselves on the map of human geography. The role of history, the role of memory, is to tell a people what they have been and where they have been, what they are and where they are. Most important, the role that history plays is that it has the function of telling a people where they still must go and what they still must be. So I think I want to end with that. Just soak that in.
It's a really powerful point for us to end on. Thank you so much, Professor McAllister, and for your presentation, for the thoughtfulness of your engagement with the audience. And I think I want to start with the question of Dr. King and our tendency to tame or to mythicize figures like him. Why do you think we, and we being the broader national discourse about figures in our history, why do we have that tendency to try and make his image easy or pacifying to our vision of ourselves as a nation?
Well, I think, for one, I think this was primarily something that the Black community pushed, right? If we're talking about the King holiday. And I mean, I have problems with the pacification of Martin Luther King, but I feel like if he wasn't pacified, we would not have the holiday. Like if the quotes that I shared with you, like if people use those quotes in terms of trying to get the holiday passed, by the government, it wouldn't have gone through. In fact, King, he was critical of capitalism itself. I mean, yeah, let me see if I can find a quote. Actually, this book begins, and I'm just going to read a little bit, and then we'll have more conversation here. So, this is chapter 1 of this book. It says, on March 27th, 1968, a week before he was killed in Memphis, Martin Luther King joined Stanley Levinson, Andrew Young, and several other confidants for an evening gathering at the New York City apartment of the singer and civil rights activist Harry Belafonte. Earlier that day, King had met with the poet Amiri Baraka in Newark, a city still reeling from deadly riots of the previous year. It was a city King feared that was poised to erupt all over again. At the time, King was working to organize the Poor People's Campaign and what was to be a multiracial march on the occupation of Washington, D.C., a mass demonstration meant to press the American people into a serious confrontation with material poverty. And in New York that evening, King was in a surly mood. He confided in Belafonte and others that Newark and his meeting with the militant Baraka had gotten to him. That suffocating conditions there and an increasing willingness among the city's youth to embrace violent resistance tactics were still again testing his long-haul strategy of nonviolent change. Now, this is an interesting quote from King. "I wholly embrace everything they feel," King said of the militant contingent in Newark. He says, "I have more in common with these young people than anybody else in this movement. I feel their rage. I feel their pain. I feel their frustration. It's the system that's the problem, and it's choking the breath out of our lives." As Belafonte recalls of the conversation that evening, it was Andrew Young, the future U.S. Congressman and ambassador to the United Nations, who unwittingly ratcheted up King's anger. "I don't know, Martin," said Young. "It's not the entire system. It's only part of it. And I think we can fix that." King was having none of it. "I don't need to hear from you, Andy," he clapped back. "You're a capitalist, and I'm not. The trouble is that we live in a failed system. Capitalism does not permit an even flow of economic resources. With this system, a small privileged few who are rich beyond conscience, and almost all others are doomed to be poor at some level. That's the way the system works. And since we know the system will not change the rules, we're going to have to change the system." Now, I could have tricked you guys and said Malcolm X said this, right? I mean, this sounds like Malcolm. But again, I think even though he's been Santa Clausified, I mean, if he wasn't tame, I don't think we would be having this conversation. So I have complicated feelings about this holiday.
Yeah. It's interesting because at the same time as we've seen this Santa Clausification or pacifying of his image, one thing that I've seen over the past more than a decade at this point are those parallel attempts to scale back that positive image, to make him not just radical, but a radical, to make him anti-American, a communist, a socialist, all of those things that run contrary to our concepts of patriotism and pride in our nation and so forth. So on the other side of that previous question, why you made reference to the title of Dr. King as an inconvenient hero. Yeah. What makes the image of him so inconvenient or such a threat?
Well, I think the fact that now he's considered, right, by most Americans as kind of a founding father.
Mhm.
I mean, I hate to make the parallel, but you can take, Moses, Jesus, the biblical prophets in a similar way, right? That you can take these individuals that are saintly, holy, and use them to push war. I mean, you think about, the KKK, that was a Christian organization, right? I don't know if that answers your question, but I think, yeah, I think that these individuals are complex as well. King is not a saint, right? He had issues, but well, at least for me, the most important piece and why he's important to me now is his analysis. That we need to see him. We need to see him as an intellectual, which he was, not only a preacher but a thinker.
Yeah. I think that's so interesting too, what you said about I think that tendency to make saints out of people that we want to be heroes, and recognizing that he was complicated, just as all of our national figures are. All of our histories throughout time have both those positive and negative aspects. So that's a really interesting point that you make. Um, I was recently having a friend with or a conversation with a friend and accomplice on Dr. King. And one of her questions as we were talking about him was she was wondering how Dr. King would be received today, or what his policies or what his politics might look like in the landscape of 2022. And it made me think of an episode of The Boondocks. The episode was set in the post September 11th landscape of 2001. And it confronted that same question of how Dr. King would be received had he survived. Their premise is that he was shot, he was fatally wounded, but he was in a coma. And so he comes back into a modern landscape. And one of the things that stood out to me in that episode was a quote that they have him state, that upon looking out at the culture of his people today, he makes the statement, "We have nothing to celebrate." By the end of the speech, he says, "You all can do what you're going to do. It seems like you're not interested in progress. I'm going to Canada." And it sparks this revolutionary change. But I'm curious what you think that a modern Dr. King would say to our cultural landscape today. Where would his perspective or his stance and views of the world stand now?
I think there's multiple ways to look at this. I mean, I just wrote down different ways, different things that have happened to our leaders. Okay, so there's the physical assassination, right, where you were literally assassinated and killed and taken out of the picture. Okay, so that. This is something that has happened, right? So Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Fred Hampton, right? You had these people that were taken out of the picture, but you also had character assassination, which has also happened to Black leaders, right? I mean, we still have people from the 60s that are incarcerated. These people are dying in prison, okay? We have people like Mumia Abu Jamal. Now, he's been criminalized, right? So for those of us who are respectable Negroes, we may not want to talk about political prisoners because, maybe he killed a police officer or not, not that I condone that, but if you think about the Second Amendment and the fact that the courts do not protect Black people, there's, that some of these people who are in prison, they may have been guilty of shooting back, right? Not that I'm for that at all, but I think it's important to realize that the state does not protect our right to protect ourselves, right? So we are criminalized. So there are still people who are incarcerated because either they've been accused of shooting back and they're innocent, or maybe they were actually protecting themselves and they killed a police officer. Okay. And so here you have people that have been criminalized. All right. So again, you have people that actually died, they were taken out of the picture. Then you have people who have been criminalized, right, by the state, by our culture. Um, and then you have people that have assimilated, okay, people that are totally invested in the system. So I hate to say this, I mean, I'm maybe that's me, right? That we are part of the system. Um, we're respectable people. We have our careers, we have our jobs. Um, and my point here, really, in all this, is we should all feel uncomfortable. We should all feel uncomfortable. We are in a system that, by the hour, is responsible for the death of children throughout the planet. We're talking about children starving in Africa, Asia, Latin America. I mean, this happens by the minute, every day, right? This is the system that we belong to. Okay, so we're all implicated. So it's not just white folks. All of us are implicated, especially Black people who are in the global north, right? Yes, we are persecuted. Yes, we're a lot of times we're not respected as human beings. We strive to be treated like human beings, but our situation is not as bad as our family people in the global south. Like the system constantly is exploiting a lot of this technology right here in this room is from mined cobalt in Africa and in the global south. So this is something that persists. So I'm really all over the place here, but yeah. So again, if King was alive, I would possibly he be incarcerated, maybe framed, all right, or maybe he'd be an Al Sharpton, maybe he'd be an Oprah Winfrey, maybe a Barack Obama, right? So that's this assimilation piece, because we don't know. It's hard to tell, right? Because of the materialism of the society. Um, yeah, but I think, yeah, either physical death or a character assassination or assimilated. He'd be assimilated.
Yeah, that leads to another question from uh, an earlier part of your presentation where you were sharing a quote from Dr. King about needing to recentralize our policies and our systemic processes from thing-oriented to people-oriented. I'm curious your thoughts on what does that mean? What does it look like for us to shift those systems, especially as you noted, when we are living within systems in which we're all complicit in one way or another with some of the wrongs that we're addressing. How do we start working to shift those things?
That is a very good question. I don't know if I have the answer. I think first we need to be uncomfortable with the system. I mean, going back to my impression of King now is the idea of hope. Now, what makes King different than many of our leaders of the past? So if we're talking about, Malcolm X, W.D. Du Bois, that King, as a revolutionary Christian, he has hope that people can change internally, right? Because I think this is an internal process. You first, and that's why he was for nonviolence as well, as in terms of morality. So we here in the global north, we who are in the United States, we should be extremely uncomfortable with the militarism of our system. We should be extremely uncomfortable with that. And see, this is the society, this militarized society has embraced Martin Luther King. So this is the interesting thing, right? You have military bands, marching on King's Day, But I don't know if I answered your question. Yeah, so how do we change? I believe there's multiple levels of struggle, and I'm not sure which one is the best, but I personally think that you have to determine where you feel the battle is. So if it's within the university, if it's changing consciousness, if it's through conversation, that's valid. If you're on the ground helping people, helping the poor, like what King did, um, helping people who are, working class people who are struggling to survive. I mean, there's all these different areas, I think, that we as individuals can change. I'm not sure that society can change with the systems that we have, right? But maybe there are systems in our neighborhood that we can create. Um, Ella Baker, who was an activist, who we should celebrate her birthday as well. She said you need to talk to your neighbor. You need to be interacting with those folks.
Yeah.
But I guess I'd throw that question back. So what can you do? What do you think?
Well, I loved what you said about it starting with being uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big proponent for, and it's something that I often bring up, especially in the modern DEI conversations or in that space, learning to dwell in discomfort.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that is the point where we start to recognize both the problems in the system and the points where we're complicit in that system. The
Mm-hmm.
point where I start to get uncomfortable with what I'm accepting is just, part of my job, or this is just what I have to do to make it in this society, where that starts to push back and I start questioning for myself.
Mm-hmm.
Am I just being complicit in a system that is hurting people,
Mm-hmm.
or that's keeping some people down to advance others? That's the point where I can start pushing back. And I think that's the risk that we can all take. It makes me wonder what that means to, if we're in these systems where we're just constantly in this state of, I'm uncomfortable with this. I don't know if I can change the system overall, but I know that I'm not okay with it as it is. It makes me wonder then, what is that enough to start changing that system? To say, if as we as organizations or as neighborhoods or as individuals, even within a system, start pushing back point by point at those different things within that system, is that going to ultimately change the system, or is it just going to be a bunch of people saying, I don't like this, but I can't change it?
Yeah, King doesn't necessarily provide the solutions here. I
Mhm.
think that Ella Baker was much more practical in it. And I hate to go on a tangent here, but Ella Baker actually believed in the democratic process of consensus, and King was more top down. I mean, I think he had a great analysis in terms of the evils, but Ella Baker was on the ground in terms of her organizing. I mean, if you look her up, she was part of the NAACP, she was part of the Southern Christian Leadership, and then she was part of SNCC, right? Different generations of struggle. But her point, her idea was that decisions need to be made through consensus, not necessarily top down. Okay, so in a sense, Ella Baker's much more radical than King, because this is where you have structural change, is through conversation, through consensus, right? Because you first have to have thought and then action, right? That follows thought in terms of, okay, what do we do to fix this problem in our community, right? You have to have consensus for that to happen. You can't wait for someone at the top to do that. And some of this is happening even within this pandemic, right? That where the state fails, community people, individuals are stepping up. And and maybe even this germ, these viruses are going to change things on the ground, right? Because we don't have the infrastructure to deal with this stuff.
Yeah, I want to highlight a comment from one of our audience members who said, I think everyone needs to work where they are. Each of us has to use their talents to make a difference, do something that works towards positive change. So I
Oh,
think that speaks beautifully into all of what we're talking about right now, that it is about um, individuals doing things. It's a part, or it's part of working towards that consensus as community or as cities or wherever we are, to address things and make those changes. And I love actually what you said about what we're seeing right now. We're in a period of ongoing discomfort with the systems that we got to be a little too comfortable with.
hmm
And I think we're seeing it in a very unique way because of what we're experiencing with the pandemic. It's why we have things like the so-called great resignation, where people aren't just satisfied with just working 9 to 5 in the same place every single day, realizing there's so much more I could be doing with my life. It's why I think we're starting to see those shifts within workplace systems. It's why we have this big boom in different uh, aspects of workplace culture or general politics or the cultural landscape period that we might not have seen if we weren't forced to sit in isolation or sit in quarantines and have to think about these things kind of 24/7. So there's something to be said, I think, for um, both working where we are, being uncomfortable with how things are, and working to make that change. Um, the last question that I have right now, I'm sure something else that we say will bring up another one, but um, we have this tendency to think or to make the argument that a fight for one group of marginalized peoples means that we are either against other groups of marginalized peoples or it's cast in the shade of anti whatever the majority is that's opposite that group. So for example, when it comes to anti-racism, DEI, CRT, there's this tendency to cast it as either anti-white or reverse racism or all of those sorts of things, or even when we have discussions of systemic oppression against a particular people, like Black people with the Black Lives Matter movement, it means to some that we don't either care about issues facing our Indigenous or Asian or Hispanic or Latino, Latina, and other brothers and sisters who are also experiencing these things, or it means that if we give something to this group, it means that we can't give it to you too because we just gave it to them. So why is it that this tendency tends to overtake us? Is it a tactic that's meant to keep those movements from progressing? Is it just the thought process of our current systems that is that thing-oriented focus, or is it something else?
It's definitely the thing-oriented focus. And actually, I'm going to paraphrase a quote by Hubert Harrison, who was considered by A. Philip Randolph. This is A. Philip Randolph is the father of the March on Washington movement. A. Philip Randolph said that Hubert Harrison was the father of the Harlem radicalism that emerges in the early 20th century. So Hubert Harrison has this quote, and this was during a period of his life that he was trying to convince socialists to take on racial justice. Okay, so we're talking about early 1910s. And in this article, he says the Negro is the touchstone of the modern democratic idea. Okay, so in other words, the Negro or the Black person is a touchstone. Now, a touchstone is something that is used to measure the value of something. So what Harrison is saying is that you can take the Black experience and rub it against the ideals of the American Revolution, right? This whole idea of freedom and democracy. And so you test it if it's really there. Is there gold? Is this really gold? Is it what it purports itself to be? Or is this lead, right? Or is this brass? So, I call this the touchstone theory. And this can apply to other situations as well, right? You can take another human experience. You can take a group that has been thingified, right? And you can, it basically tells you whether this is democracy or not. Okay. You can use the indigenous experience with this, right? In fact, in some cases, you can have other racial groups that will play our part, right? So as a citizen, a non-documented worker in Guatemala who's indigenous, that person is more of the other than I am. So in a sense, they've taken they're playing our role as the outsider. So I think to answer your question, I guess you could say, well, who's playing the role of the touchstone? In other words, if you're finding a group where democracy is not really there, right? Because he goes on to say that he says take the Declaration of Independence, for instance, that was a splendid idea. He says the black man merely touched it and it becomes a splendid lie. Right? So that's the touchstone. So that's one way to gauge it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been a really insightful, thought-provoking. I could apply so many words to this conversation. I'm going to be thinking about it, I know, for the rest of the day. And I hope our audience is as well, especially as we come to the celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day tomorrow. It's an opportunity that, as we were talking about before this session started, many take as just a chance to have another day off. But it's really a chance for us to stop and think about these things and to think about what does it mean to celebrate his legacy. It's a time for us to think about what really was his legacy. What lessons is he teaching us even today? And how can we apply that in a way that's more meaningful than just kicking back and doing nothing? What could we do instead that really celebrates that day? So I put that question to our audience and just ask that as you go forward after this presentation, you think as well about what can you do differently tomorrow that you might not have thought to do before listening in on this session. Where can you find that opportunity to work where you are, to use your talent to make a difference, to do something that works towards positive change, to live the dream, literally, but also to move beyond just that comfort with the ideals of the I Have a Dream speech into some of his, Dr. King's other words, some of his other urgings for our society. So as we think about that, as you move forward with your day and into tomorrow, we thank you as always for joining us. Thank you to Professor McAllister for leading us in this conversation today. We hope that you'll continue to come back and join us for our upcoming sessions throughout the rest of this month and the year. And until we see you again, we as always say to go forward, be well, and be blessed.